What are some of Leif's biggest storylines for this 2022-23 college basketball season regarding NBA prospects? Find out right here, because nobody watches more college basketball than Leif, so you know he's got some interesting takes. Stay tuned. Shout out to each and every person that has made the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline, because BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is where the game starts. I am your host, Rafael Barlowe, the director of scouting for NBA Big Board and the founder of NBA Draft Junkies. And my co-host, I might have to start calling him Leif Stradamus, because he's made some pretty good predictions that have come to pass early. The first one was he thought Steve Nash would be on the hot seat. I even saw some people voting for Nash as potential coach of the year. And 7 games in, he is out. So, Leif, what is going on? Do you have any more predictions for us? Because I know you got the Nash one right. You said that, and I was shocked. I disagreed with you at the time, that Ochai Agbaji was out the Jazz rotation, and he's starting to get some minutes there, but he's playing far less than what I expected. I don't know, man. I think I might need to call you for this Powerball. You might at least be able to get me half the numbers right.
I hope so. The Agbaji one, I think you're being a little too kind. Being a Jazz guy, I kind of had. I wouldn't say intel that was firm, but I had inklings from, read through the lines and saw that he seemed to be the odd man out of what I'd seen at the scrimmage that they played and just some preseason rotations. So that one, I don't think I was reading tea leaves necessarily. I just kind of had good information. The Nash one, I'll take some credit for. I felt pretty confident he or Doc Rivers, one of those teams with high expectations and teams with not, I wouldn't say great chemistry, but I'll say maybe low chemistry, but high expectations. And like short fuses on their team. I think they had a tougher job, so I thought I'd hedge my bet by saying one of the two, but it did happen pretty quickly. I wasn't expecting it to be that fast.
So, do you think that they weren't confident in him going into the season, or do you think that he just said, you know what, this is too much going on with the Kyrie stuff, with the Ben Simmons stuff? What do you think really happened? And of course, this is just your opinion. Don't want somebody to say, write an article saying Leif and Rafael said this is exactly what happened. What do you think happened? Because I think it's weird that you fire him after 7 games. Like, if you already thought you were going to fire him and you weren't confident in him, why you probably bring in your, a new coach, for preseason, or to at least implement some type of offense?
My thinking was, and I guess is, that there's a lot of moving pieces. There are high expectations. The best player on the team didn't buy into Nash's coaching style, and that was KD. And then the second and third best players on the team are unreliable. They're supremely talented, but have been unreliable in terms of availability, which is sometimes the best ability. And the other sense is that I would say mentally, they're both sporadic. They can be locked in and phenomenal, but they also have moments where their beliefs and injury tendencies. And we know everything about Kyrie's stance of he wasn't able to play due to vaccination, and Ben Simmons was out for a very long time with an injury that many were speculating on, which I don't think is necessarily fair. But you have all these built up expectations, and your second and third best players are unreliable in terms of availability, which is the best ability, and your best player doesn't buy the coach. I think there's writing on the wall there.
Tough situation, man. Hopefully he gets another opportunity, because I don't think anybody really would have succeeded. And it's just crazy. Like, if KD's foot was a little smaller, the outcome is different in 2021. Then if Harden is healthy, that could be a totally different outcome. There's a lot of ifs. If Kyrie gets the vaccine, it's so many different ifs. But let's talk about your favorite storylines for this upcoming college basketball season, which starts in like 5 days or so, 5 or 6 days.
Can't
I'm looking
wait.
forward to it. Yeah, I can't wait either. And I know you watch a lot of college basketball. Actually, you watch more college basketball than anyone else. So what is your top storyline for this season regarding the NBA draft and prospects?
I think the first one for me is somewhat obvious. It's who's going 3. We've got Wembanyama and Scoot penciled in at 1 and 2. Number 3 is a real expectation. I'll extend it a little bit further. Is who's the first collegiate player off the board, and does one collegiate player jump over Amen Thompson, who's kind of I would say he's not consensus, but he would be the most popular pick at number 3 right now, based off what I've kind of seen in mocks and big boards and reading a few articles from that teams are publishing super early on.
So there's a guy that has been listening to all of our episodes, goes by the name of Mike Jones. I wonder if it's the Mike Jones. Was it 281-330-8004?
I'm too young, but I've heard it.
Okay. He is going to say that Nick Smith is number 2, and then maybe Scoot number 3. And yeah, I mean, that's an interesting storyline, because I agree 100%. Who will be the first college player off the board? Some may say Cam Whitmore. Some may say Derek Whitehead. Some think it's Nick Smith. Some still think Derek Lively has a chance. So who is your guy that's number 1 as far as the top college player?
I think I'm going with Cam Whitmore. I actually was having this discussion with my buddy on my pickup basketball team. We played a game tonight, and we had this exact discussion before.
Did you get buckets? Did you get buckets?
I was dropping dimes. I think I had a double with assists and rebounds. The shot wasn't falling today, but my team was winning big, so I was just pushing the pace, throwing the ball ahead, being a good team player.
Draymond. Okay.
Yeah. The shot used to be kind of the thing. I haven't played enough to be too super confident in it, but whatever helps the team win is kind of my thinking.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So you say Cam Whitmore.
I'm leaning towards him as my first collegiate player. I'd go Amen Thompson 3, and then number 4, I think I'm going Cam Whitmore above Nick Smith.
So here's my storyline. And Villanova just doesn't have a history of one and dones. And usually guys that have these one and done aspirations don't go to Villanova. I mean, I shouldn't say that like that's guaranteed, but usually you just don't see the guys that everybody's penciling in as one and done going to Villanova. They usually go to the same schools or whatever. So that's one of my storylines and Villanova has a new coach, so things could be totally different. But is he going to put up crazy numbers? What is his role going to be? How is Villanova going to look? So that's one of my storylines.
I really think that the Virginia says the pillars, but Villanova, for lack of better term, is the pillars of their program is unselfishness, playing off 2 feet, being disciplined. You know, all these things where they are a very cohesive unit. I think that the reason a lot of freshmen haven't been attracted to going to Villanova is because they know they have to wait their turn. There's going to be players ahead of them that have developed like over 5 years, like Archie Diacono, like Gillespie. But I don't think it necessarily is a perilous spot for a guy like Whitmore to go, because he plays in a style that doesn't have to adapt too much. He plays off 2 feet. He's super aggressive. He can shoot the ball, which is always something Villanova kind of 3-4s play, and that factors into him. And then my biggest reason I have him number 3, and I do have that concern that I wonder how egalitarian Villanova's system is. Could that hurt him? But I also think that there have been a couple players that have gone number 4 recently that have played on really good teams and have similar bills. Like DeAndre Hunter won a national championship at Virginia, but he was arguably the 3rd best player on that team in terms of a collegiate standard behind Kyle Guy and Ty Jerome. Patrick Williams came off the bench on a number 1 seed Florida State team. My thinking is that he played the best at the highest level. He played at the U19 and he was the best player. And whereas like a guy like Derek Whitehead's coming off of an injury to his feet, which I'm more concerned about than the injury to Cam Whitmore. A guy like Keontae George, I think he's got tons of players that will make it hard for him. Nick Smith, I feel like he's got to shoulder the biggest load if he wants to get that high, but he's got the potential to do so. And I think same with Derek Lively. I think Lively's got to be phenomenal to stand out as Duke's best player. So I think the path is difficult for most of these college guys to stand out and really put up supremely impressive numbers.
Well, here's a question for you about Whitmore and his performance this summer. I think it was the under 18. So he had such a strong performance, without a doubt. I mean, he definitely helped himself there. But the bracket America plays in is not a difficult bracket, right?
That's fair.
It's not the same as the European bracket. And not saying that European basketball is better, but when you look at North America, or just the Americas, there's quite a few countries where there's not a lot of talent, definitely not a lot of NBA talent coming from the Americas. You take Argentina, okay, Canada, and that's, I mean, those are the other teams. While, in Europe, you have definitely stronger talent coming from these countries and like the European championships or so on. So the team this summer, the event that they played in was not the same as the event that the U16s or the U17s played. So do you think that has the weak competition kind of made them stand out a little bit more?
I do, but I would say that you can't control your competition in that sense. And he took it to the best of his ability. There were other players that would love to be drafted this year that were on his team, and he stood out the most amongst them and didn't do it in a selfish, show-offy way. So I buy his success. I think he shoots the ball very well, and he's a physically imposing guy. And I think he kind of fits the NBA mold of what they're looking for in terms of athletes and with touch and finesse. And I think a place like Villanova is a very good spot for him to hone some of the nuances of becoming an NBA player.
I agree. So again, we have that in common. Those are your storyline and my storyline are very similar. When we return, we'll find out what is Leif's number 2 storyline for this college basketball season regarding NBA prospects. But first, let me tell you about BetOnline, because betonline.net is your number 1 source for football and the start of the new basketball season. So you can find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It is the fastest and the easiest way to check on all your favorite games and events, including Major League Baseball, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today and use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, it is where the game starts. Shout out to each and every person that has made the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. And I want to give a special shout out to 3 guys that are always in the comments on the YouTube. It is Mike Jones, Norin Rad, and Chris Keese. These guys are always commenting and sharing their thoughts, whether they agree or not. It's great dialogue. So shout out to you guys for supporting the podcast and on the YouTube channel. Now, for your second listen of the day, I'd strongly advise you to check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. From games that matter the most, the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insight only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today. It is available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Leif, your number 2 storyline regarding NBA prospects for this season.
Yeah, this one will vary depending different boards, but my number 2 storyline is who is going to become a top 10 pick that we don't necessarily foresee. There's a lot of 5-star prospects. There's a lot of guys that whether they're from G League, Overtime, Ignite, Wembanyama, obviously, that are shoo-ins to be in the top 10. But who's going to surprise me in the top 10, and specifically which non-traditional blue blood programs are going to be featured in that top 10? Because I think, especially with NIL, the transfer portal, and just there's more parity in college basketball, that there's going to be more people that are going to frequent the top 10 and more schools that'll frequent the top 10 than typically, Kentucky and Duke. Like, for instance, Arkansas may have 2 top 10 picks, and that's not necessarily a surprise. So my storyline is who's going to surprise and get there, and which schools are going to start to be featured more in top 10s.
Yeah, so here's one that I have. All right. So if you look at last year around this time, and I'd say if you did a consensus, the top 10 picks were like Patrick Baldwin, Peyton Watson, Yannick Sosa, Jaden Hardy. I'm probably forgetting somebody else. And none of those guys were in the lottery, right? Jabari Smith, who for a lot of reasons, a lot of people thought that he was the best player in college basketball, or the best NBA prospect for a large majority of the season. He wasn't someone that I saw people list as a top 3 pick, right? It was, I heard Chet, I heard Ben Caro, some thought Hardy, it was so many different scenarios. So I said all that to say this: the guys that we're probably projecting on our big boards as top 10 picks, there's a good chance that 5 of them won't even be lottery picks, just because that's just how weird college basketball is. Now, do you have a guy that you think could have like this breakout year that could creep up into the top 10?
I've got one that I think you and I are higher on, but like if you look at a board like Tankathon, which I've got pulled up right now, he's at number 19. Brandon Miller at Alabama, I'm very high on. We talked about his skill set. One of the big knocks is shot selection, and typically that means if you're making some shots like that you've got the bag to do so. He's number 19, so that's not a big jump, but I could see him cracking the top 7. Like I could see him entering the conversation of our first storyline that we discussed of who could be one of the 2 or 3 first college players selected. And I'm not saying he necessarily will, but that's a guy that I think is less heralded than the guys we've heard about forever. For instance, Dariq Whitehead at one point played with Cade Cunningham, and some of those Montverde guys. Like that was a ridiculously stacked team, but we know what Dariq Whitehead is. Derek Lively was the number 1 player in the class. Like that's no surprise. Keontae George went to IMG. Jarris Walker was at IMG. You see these guys in the spotlight. My point being is there's going to be a few guys, and I think he's the most likely candidate to crack that top 7, top 10, even if he's not that far out of most people's boards. I just think there's going to be a couple players that jump up, and there's going to be some, like you mentioned, that fall. Like, for instance, Dylan Mitchell at Texas is going to have a bit of a log jam. I think he could easily be a top 10 pick if he kind of overcomes and becomes the head of that hierarchy scoring. But there's a lot of guys there that need the basketball, and I could see him having some freshman woes, or he could really thrive. And because he's got a name brand like Texas on what should be a good team, he could really thrive, but he could also kind of slip the other way because of the same situation.
Yeah. Speaking of Brandon Miller, so I was at the Tennessee Gonzaga game on Friday, and I was able to sit next to some scouts and talk to some agents and guys that are doing some evaluations. And one guy told me Brandon Miller is a top 5 pick.
I agree.
He went to a practice, and he was just telling me about where he's been and so on. So he goes to a practice, and I said, how did Brandon Miller look? And he's just like, I said, that good? I mean, it's just, you can't see him on the podcast, but he kind of shook his head and his eyebrows raised. And so I was like, that good? And he says, yeah. I said, like, top 10 good? And he's like, nodding. I'm like, top 7 good? He's nodding. I say, top 5 good? And then he's nodding. He's just like, yeah. And so I talked to another scout about him, and he was kind of torn in a sense, because his theory wasn't, let me know if you agree or disagree. Of course, at this point, nobody's right or wrong at this point in the season. He said that he liked Miller. He understood the intrigue, but he felt like he is older for this class. He said he's older than some of the returning sophomores. And despite the fact that he's been older, he's concerned about the lack of progression in his shooting. He said he's been on the radar for years. He has all these tools, but he feels like he has not gotten better as a shooter. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's the swing skill. I want to see him do it in an SEC play specifically. I think the SEC is going to be really good this year. I'd rank them as the best conference in basketball. I know that's controversial this year, but that's my take. Is there's going to be some really good teams, and if he's able to score well in the SEC, I buy it. And I think there's some things he can do better, but for what it's worth, I've got him number 6 on my board right now, and I'm hair close to putting him 5. I just need to see some college basketball, and I'm itching for it. November 7th can't come fast enough for me. But But I'd say this is I think he's the prime candidate for me on a non-traditional blue blood school or non-top 10 recruit that I think is likely to be in the top 7. I really buy his upside. I think people are going to kind of fall in love and become enamored by like the Paul George comparisons that are getting tossed out a little bit. And there's a couple other guys I think have a good chance as well, but he's the one I would pinpoint. Like I'm curious to get your read. There's a lot of guys in the SEC that I think have a chance to be one and dones on not necessarily amazing teams. Like for instance, what's GG Jackson going to do on a fairly porous South Carolina team, but he's got all the skills to do so. Just depends how efficient he is, I think. But Miller's shooting is less of a concern to me because he can put the ball in the hole, whether it's smooth or rough. He finds a way.
Right. Now, one of the concerns is shot selection. So do you feel like if he has questionable shot selection and he's not a lights out shooter, do you think that he's going to have some issues with efficiency?
He could. He could. I'm gonna choose to select the flashes that I've seen and really buy them as top level scoring in this class. We did a shot creators episode last week, and he was in my top 5 and firmly in there. And I just feel like if you've got the ability to do and score taking tough shots, like Jason Tatum and Paolo Banchero were 2 that I would recently come to mind, I take it as a knock. I say, man, like you shouldn't be shooting that, and it bugs me. But then they make it enough to where I'm like, okay, that's fine. And then once they define that and kind of work on it over a summer, and then they go to the NBA, like you can see Banchero's thriving because he's shooting smart shots. He's not forcing the ball very much, and he's easily the best rookie in the NBA right now. And I think I'm not saying that's what Miller is going to be necessarily. I just think that it's a correctable skill set that really means that he's got a tremendous skill set to work with to begin with.
Valid. I agree. All right. When we return, we'll get a few more of Leif's storylines. Stay tuned. All right. Once again, it's Rafael Barlowe with my guest, Leif Thulin, and we're just covering a few storylines that he's looking forward to seeing for this upcoming college basketball season, which is now days away. All right. What is next for you? What is the next storyline that you'll be paying attention to regarding an NBA prospect?
I've got a kind of a mix of one here. So my question is, how does winning and being on an integral part of a winning college basketball team that can contend? Because I think most of these guys are on very high level teams. Even a guy like Jarace Walker, who's Houston's rarely a one and done factory, but that's a team that's top 5 preseason. We've got Duke, Kentucky always litter that realm. Arkansas is supposed to be very good. How does
smacked,
winning,
even though it was like a unofficial game, they got smacked. So did Gonzaga. So I don't know if that means anything, but it's weird that you see these teams that are highly ranked and even these unofficial games, but just losing by such huge margins.
Yeah. So my question is, how does winning affect these guys' performances, and how does it affect their draft stock specifically if it means that they're not having as large of individual roles? And secondly, which guys that are injured or suspended early in the year, because there are a fair amount of them, like Baba Miller. We talked about Whitmore. We talked about Dariq Whitehead, Derek Lively, a couple injuries to crucial pieces to this draft class that I'm curious to see how that impacts their stock.
Yeah, I mean, that's very, very good question. I know Miller's going to miss half the season. I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I'm like, he has to be able to appeal. Like maybe you appeal, you get a few games until the next situation, then you appeal it again and just keep appealing until the season is over. I mean, that would be my take if it's even possible. Still seems unfair that he got 16 games in this whole NIL world. But the guy that comes to mind when you talk about the winning and production is Julian Phillips. And I spoke with someone that mentioned that if he averages 5 points a game for Tennessee, which, I mean, they looked very, very good. And I was at the game against Gonzaga, but he's like, if he averages 5 points a game, they don't need him to win. They don't need him to be successful. Of course, it would help, but he could easily be a top 15 through 30 guy with not good numbers. He just has to show some flashes. And the person mentioned that they think that he should do 2 years, because they felt like if he stays for a second year it will allow him to showcase a little bit of leadership and just have a bigger role, because they felt like he's naturally not aggressive and he's naturally going to just blend in. And if he's going to blend in with this team that has some older guys or upperclassmen, I mean, they got some guys that are like 24, then is he going to be assertive? Is he going to be aggressive? And so that was a storyline that a scout mentioned to me, is to watch how his role is, and if he's going to be assertive, and if he's even productive in a sense, because like I said, Tennessee doesn't need him to be successful.
Yeah, and then that I circled a few guys and he was on there that I thought would really have very interesting draft stocks depending on how good their teams are. Julian Phillips, Dylan Mitchell, Jarace Walker, and I'd even say the opposite end of the spectrum for GG Jackson, because if South Carolina is really bad and he's forced to do a ton, I worry that his efficiency will make people lean away. And the other three are the same thing with Julian Phillips, is because those teams are supposed to be really good. Do you want the ball in the freshman's hand, or do you want it in Mark Sasser's hands at the end of the game if you're Houston? And do you want Marcus Carr and Tyrese Hunter touching the ball, or do you want it in Dylan Mitchell's hands for Texas? So yeah, that's something I'm very intrigued about, and time will tell. And the trust in coaches, and this will impact recruiting for years to come, because should Julian Phillips return to Tennessee, they're going to lose Santiago Vescovi. They're going to lose probably Kamwa. They're big. They're going to lose Josiah Jordan-James, who's kind of occupying the position that Phillips would like to play.
And he didn't even play on Friday.
Yeah, and then they're deep. They're deep. I did a SEC podcast, and I had him 3, and I'm kind of regretting it. But that's for another thing.
Rafael Team, he's going to be good for them. I wasn't familiar with him. I'll be honest, I wasn't familiar with him until at the game, and he was a bucket at Indiana State before he transferred. Then he had to sit out a year, and he's going to be big. And I talked to one of their coaches, and he's like, this team is much better than last year, and last year's team was pretty good.
Michigan State head coach Tom Izzo said something today. He said they're Final Four good easily. That's their own scrimmage. So 2 for 2 for Tennessee. And then as for the other one was with these injuries, like maybe you know more about the timetables than I do. They're kind of keeping it hush hush for guys like Dariq Whitehead, who hurt his foot. That's a scary injury for a guard. That's supposed to be. He's not necessarily like an elite athlete, but he's a guy who's a kind of a downhill driver. He's got good wiggle to his game, and like Cam Whitmore does his shooting struggle with a thumb injury, and there's a few other guys like that I'm concerned about in that regard.
Yeah, and I don't have any insight or any knowledge about the injuries other than what's already been public, but yeah, I mean that's definitely going to play a role. Then, like you said, the guys that are sitting out, I mean, he's not necessarily a guy that's going to be super high on draft boards, but you look at like Arizona and Ramey, he's going to miss some games.
Adama Ball is going to be a guy to watch for he's going to be stepping in for Ramey for a few games.
Yep. So is there any other storyline that you feel deserves a little bit of attention?
One that I think this is not at the top of the draft board, but NIL's influencing people to come back more easily, like Drew Timme, Oscar Tshiebwe, Armando Bacot are examples of this. Trace Jackson Davis as well. Hunter Dickinson, a lot of big guys that aren't necessarily fits for right now's NBA.
Yes, what I'm about to say.
How
they
much
all have something in common.
How much does NIL impact that? And then where are they going to go in a draft where they've clearly going to implement what they've been told by scouts to work on? How much can they improve their stock? And then who this year that you expect to do well is going to take that feedback and come back and make what I'd say for most of those guys a wise decision to play another year of college basketball if you can get paid to do so.
Yeah, it's funny because I thought the NIL was going to have a huge impact on the draft. I thought guys that were fringe guys or you weren't getting first round feedback, I thought, okay, these guys, especially if you're at a blue blood school,
you're
going to take the NIL money. To my surprise, the only guy that really shocked me was Terquavion Smith. Maybe Caleb Love. I think if he would have had a big game, his last game, then maybe he would have went. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of like it's it seems like the guys that are taking advantage of it and the money in a sense are the bigs. And these are bigs that a lot of people say, oh, they don't necessarily fit the modern NBA. They're better than a lot, like, skill wise, more skilled than a lot of the run and jump guys that are, that are going to be first round picks. But yeah, I mean, that's a very good observation. I'm just curious to see what happens if guys are going to look at, you look at JD Davison, you look at Peyton Watson, you look at Patrick Baldwin. I'm probably missing a few, but these guys that left early after their freshman years and are not playing at all, right? I think JD's going to spend a lot of time in the G League. You see Jaden Hardy has already been assigned to the G League. So I wonder, are guys going to say, is it worth it to be like a second round pick? Because even some guys that are drafting a second round, their teams are only offering them 2 ways. Do you want to be a 2-way guy and play in the G League? Or do you say, I'm going to stay in school, I'm going to get better, and I can probably make 6 figures? I mean, some of the salaries I've heard from NIL, I don't know how true they are, and it's kind of tough to determine what is a rumor or not. But I've heard some of these guys are getting high six figure, not necessarily like high, like $800,000 or $900,000, but I hear some guys are getting $200,000-$300,000 deals, $10,000 a month deals for the NIL, and you're gonna play 30 minutes a game.
Yeah, so I wonder how many people said, wow, Keegan Murray, wow, Johnny Davis, or even a guy like Ochai Agbaji if you're a little older. And you say, you know what, I'm going to bet on myself, work on what they tell me to work on, and come back and say, you know what, I can go 20 spots higher in the draft rather than 40. I can go 20 rather than 30. I can go 10. And I think that's going to become more prevalent with NIL, and it's just a matter of time. Though I will echo your sentiment that I think a lot of people made what I would determine as ill-advised decisions going early. I thought JD Davidson should have come back, for instance. I thought Baldwin, I was okay with that one just because I knew his shooting would eventually be something that people were allured to. But the point remains, I think it's going to become a more prevalent thing. And I really, when it came out, I was like, wow, transfer portal and NIL is really going to impact the draft. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, transfer portal, definitely, because I could even see, like, I use Julian Phillips for an example. He could end up being behind, even though they don't necessarily play the same position, but Tyreek Key, who is like 24. He's probably, is he 6 years older than Julian Phillips? At least 5 at the minimum. And I talked about it on a previous podcast from this weekend, is that I spoke to a parent, and he's like, college basketball is not for 18-year-olds anymore. Unless you're top 10 or top 20 recruit, college basketball is full of guys that are 22 through 25. And he even said that one kid that he used to coach is behind a 26-year-old. And he's like, he's just not going to play. So
I bet he's at Memphis.
No, it's I know you're talking about his name, like
DeAndre Williams.
DeAndre Williams. Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, thank you so much for sharing your storylines. I mean, you always have great takes, and thank you, the listener, for making the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast one of, actually, you know what, for making it your first listen of the day. Now, for your next listen, please check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. It is available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Rafael. This is Leif, and we are out.